At the small wooden table in their cramped apartment, Ike sat hunched over a scattered pile of crumpled bills and coins. His large, muscular frame, once a source of pride, now seemed to sag under the weight of exhaustion. His rough, calloused hands, worn from years of manual labor, trembled slightly as he tried to organize the little money they had left. His face, deeply lined with the stress of endless financial struggles, bore the marks of countless sleepless nights. Across from him, Ada sat in the dim light of the solitary bulb hanging from the ceiling, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the bills. Her eyes, once bright and full of hope, had dulled over time, becoming heavy with the burdens they had been carrying for years. Her simple cotton dress clung loosely to her, and her hair, tied back in a messy bun, revealed the etched lines of worry on her otherwise youthful face. She sighed, a sound full of weariness and resignation. "We don't have enough here, Ike," Ada said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder would somehow make the reality worse. "This is barely enough for the rent, and we still need to buy groceries." Ike rubbed his tired eyes, trying to suppress the frustration boiling inside him. "I know, Ada. I've been trying to pick up extra work, but there's nothing. I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this." Ada's eyes filled with unshed tears as she watched her husband, the man she loved, crumble under the weight of their struggles. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand on his, the warmth of her touch a fleeting comfort in the coldness of their reality. "We've been through worse," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to summon hope from within. "We'll find a way. We always do." Ike forced a weak smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I just wish it didn't have to be so hard, Ada. I wish I could give you more than just promises." "It's not about the promises," Ada replied softly. "It's about us, being together and trying. That's what matters." Ada's attempt at a smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. The weight of their situation pressed down on both of them, threatening to suffocate the small flicker of hope they still clung to. Ike stood up and walked toward the window, staring out into the dark night, as if the answer to their problems was hidden somewhere out there. "Sometimes I wonder if things will ever get better," Ike muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "It feels like I'm running as fast as I can, but I'm not moving forward." Ada joined him at the window, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We can't give up hope, Ike. You always say it's the storm that makes the sailor. We'll weather this storm. We have to." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I've been thinking maybe we should talk to my mother. She's been offering to help for a while now, and I know you don't like the idea, but maybe we could use a little support." Ike's face tightened as her words sank in. He turned away from the window, pacing the small space of their apartment, his hands running through his hair in agitation. "Ada, you know how your father feels about us. He's never approved of me, and I don't want to be seen as relying on them, especially after the way he treated me when I told him I wanted to marry you." "I know, Ike, I know," Ada said, her voice soft but insistent. "But we have to make hard choices sometimes. Right now, we need help." Ike's pride clashed with the reality of their situation. He stopped pacing, staring at the floor as he weighed her words. After what felt like an eternity, he finally nodded, his voice barely audible. "Okay, we'll talk to her, but I don't want to cause more trouble between you and your father." Ada let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and smiled weakly. "Thank you, Ike. I'll call her tomorrow. We'll figure this out together." As Ada moved to check the stew on the stove, Ike returned to his seat at the table, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. Despite the flickering light and the scent of simmering food filling their small apartment, the darkness of their reality loomed large. But in each other's presence, there was still a glimmer of hope, however faint, that they would survive this storm together. In the small, dimly lit kitchen of their apartment, the rich scent of simmering stew filled the air, mingling with the underlying tension that had settled over the space. Ada stood at the stove, stirring the pot with quiet resolve, her face a mask of determination. The kitchen, though modest with its worn tiles and simple wooden cabinets, had always felt like a safe haven for the couple. But lately, the warmth of their home had been overshadowed by the weight of their struggles. Ike sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a tattered newspaper, though his mind was elsewhere. He tried to focus on the words in front of him, but all he could think about was the mounting pressure they were under. The financial strain was one thing, but the unspoken grief that hung between him and Ada was harder to bear. Their inability to have children had cast a shadow over their marriage, one that neither of them had the strength to confront openly. Ada glanced over at Ike, her heart heavy with the same burden. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice tentative. "Maybe we should see a specialist. Figure out what's going on." Ike sighed, lowering the newspaper. "Ada, we've talked about this. We're already stretched thin. I don't want to add something else to worry about." "I know," Ada replied, her eyes dropping to the floor. "But every day feels like a reminder of what we don't have. It's like carrying a weight no one else can see." Ike looked at her, his heart aching at the sight of the pain she tried so hard to hide. He reached across the table and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We're in this together, Ada. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a team. Just promise me you won't let this tear us apart." Ada nodded, though the knot in her chest tightened. "I promise." Their conversation was cut short by the sound of a knock at the door. Before Ada could answer, her mother, Mrs. Okoro, entered the apartment with a sense of urgency that immediately set Ada on edge. Mrs. Okoro, usually composed and controlled, now appeared frazzled, her face lined with worry. "Ike, Ada," she greeted them quickly, barely taking a moment to sit down. "I need to talk to you, Ada. It's about the family business." Ada wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and hurried over to her mother, concern etched into her features. "What's going on, Mama? What's wrong?" Mrs. Okoro's voice lowered, her words coming quickly. "Your father's health has worsened. He's no longer able to manage the business, and we're in a difficult situation. There's a crucial transaction coming up, and I need your help to make sure it goes smoothly." Ada's heart raced as her mother's words sank in. She had always known that one day the responsibility of the family business would fall on her, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon or in such a critical moment. "Of course, Mama," she said, her voice firm despite the anxiety bubbling within her. "I'll do whatever I can." But Ada's concern went deeper than just the business. "This isn't just about the transaction, is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Mrs. Okoro sighed, her expression softening. "No, Ada. Your father still feels disappointed. He's always believed that you didn't live up to his expectations. Helping with the business might change his mind. It's important, not just for the company, but for our family." Ada's shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of her mother's words. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself to her father, but no matter what she did, it never seemed to be enough. Now, with the family business in jeopardy, the pressure to succeed felt overwhelming. "I'll give it my best," Ada promised, her voice barely hiding the anxiety she felt. "I just hope it's enough." Mrs. Okoro nodded, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I know you will, Ada. We need to act quickly. I'll give you the details tomorrow." After her mother left, Ada stood at the window, staring out into the twilight sky. Ike walked up behind her, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "You'll do great, Ada," he whispered, his voice full of quiet confidence. "You've always been strong, and no matter what happens, I'll be here for you." Ada smiled weakly, though her heart felt heavy. "Thank you, Ike," she said, her voice soft. "I just hope I can make them proud." As the days passed, Ada found herself deeper in the tangled web of her family's business. The tasks that had once seemed straightforward were now a series of complex negotiations, financial reports, and endless decisions. Every morning, She left their small apartment before the sun rose, and every evening she returned home long after dark, feeling more exhausted and overwhelmed than the day before. Ike noticed the strain in his wife's eyes whenever she came through the door, but he was dealing with his own frustrations. Though Ada had given him some much-needed financial relief, the weight of their ongoing struggles still pressed down on him, suffocating any hope of respite. His dreams of starting a business, of building something that would lift them out of poverty, seemed just as distant as ever. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Ada returned home to find Ike slumped over the kitchen table, his head resting in his hands. The dim light from the single bulb cast long shadows across the room, emphasizing the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. "Ike?" Ada said softly as she walked toward him. "What's wrong?" Ike lifted his head, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and despair. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, Ada. I've been trying everything, but it feels like we're going nowhere." Ada's heart ached at the sight of him so defeated. She knew how hard he had been working, how much pressure he was under. She reached out, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find a way, Ike," she said, though her own heart felt hollow. "We always do." But even as she spoke the words, Ada knew the truth. They had been saying the same thing for years, and nothing had changed. That night, as she lay in bed beside Ike, her mind raced with thoughts of how to solve their problems. Desperation gnawed at her, pushing her toward a decision she had never thought she would make. The next day at her family's office, Ada sat in front of the financial ledger, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the numbers. The upcoming transaction required a sum of money that seemed insurmountable, but all she could think of was Ike, his tired face, his unspoken fears, the life they had dreamed of building together. If she could just borrow the money, just this once, maybe they could finally get ahead. With a deep breath, Ada began the process of withdrawing the funds. As she moved the money into a different account, it felt as though she was sinking deeper into a dark, suffocating ocean. The transaction was done in minutes, but the weight of her actions settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. That evening, when Ada returned home, she held a large envelope tightly in her hands. Ike looked up from the couch, his eyes curious but weary. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the envelope. Ada forced a smile, walking over to him with deliberate steps. "It's from the work I've been doing with my father," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "We had a successful deal, and I wanted to share the profits with you." Ike hesitated for a moment, disbelief flickering across his face. Slowly, he opened the envelope, his eyes widening as he saw the thick stack of bills inside. His breath caught in his throat. "Ada, this is incredible. We can finally start the business I've been dreaming about." Ada stood frozen as Ike embraced her, his face lighting up with joy she hadn't seen in years. He was so happy, so full of hope, but all Ada could feel was the heavy guilt gnawing at her from the inside. She buried her face in his shoulder, her eyes welling with tears that she fought to keep hidden. "Yes, Ike," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can finally start fresh." As the months passed, Ike's life transformed before his eyes. The small business he had started with the money Ada gave him grew rapidly, far beyond what he had ever imagined. Each day brought new opportunities, new clients, new doors opening to a future he had long dreamed of, but never thought possible. He threw himself into his work with renewed energy, determined to make the most of this chance. At home, Ike's excitement was palpable. Every evening, he came through the door with stories of new deals, of partnerships that would expand their business even further. The atmosphere in their apartment shifted from one of despair to one of hope. And for the first time in years, it felt like they were on the verge of something great. But while Ike's success soared, Ada's world was crumbling. The money she had taken from her family's business was supposed to be used for a critical transaction, and without it, The company was starting to feel the strain. Suppliers were demanding payment up front, employees were complaining about missing bonuses, and the financial reports were beginning to show the cracks. Each day, Ada lived in fear that her secret would be discovered. She had hoped to replace the money before anyone noticed, but time was running out, and she hadn't found a way to fix it. The weight of her lie pressed down on her, growing heavier with each passing day. One night, after Ike had gone to bed, Ada sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop. The numbers on the screen blurred before her eyes as she tried to figure out a way to cover the missing funds. She checked the balance again, hoping against hope that something had changed, but it hadn't. The company was on the brink of disaster, and it was her fault. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the suffocating silence. It was a message from her mother, asking about the upcoming transaction. Ada's heart raced as she typed out a response, her fingers trembling. "The books are looking good, Mama," she lied, her stomach churning with guilt. She closed the laptop, feeling the walls closing in around her. Meanwhile, Ike's business continued to grow. He was spending more time away from home, attending meetings and business events, networking with influential people. At one such event, Ike met Stella, a beautiful, charismatic woman who seemed genuinely interested in his work. They began talking, first about business, then about life. Ike found Stella easy to talk to in a way that surprised him. She understood the pressures of success, the weight of responsibility, and soon she became more than just a business acquaintance. One evening, Ike decided to surprise Ada by coming home earlier than usual. He had been working long hours for weeks, trying to build on the success of his growing business, and felt he had neglected Ada in the process. As he approached their apartment, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Frowning, he quietly pushed it open and stepped inside, careful not to make a sound. The apartment was dimly lit, and as he entered, he could hear the faint murmur of Ada's voice coming from the living room. Her tone was low, almost tearful, and Ike's heart clenched with worry. He stood frozen in the hallway, his curiosity getting the better of him, and strained to hear what she was saying. On the phone, Ada was speaking with her mother, her voice trembling. "Mama, I don't know what to do. They took everything. I was scammed of the money meant for the transaction." Ike's eyes widened as he processed her words. "Scammed!" His mind immediately began racing. "What transaction? What money?" Ada continued, her voice breaking. "It was all of it, Mama. The entire 20 million naira we needed. I thought I could fix it before anyone found out, but now I've made everything worse. 20 million naira. Ike's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. 20 million was the exact amount Ada had given him months ago to start his business, claiming it was a return from a successful deal with her father. But now it was clear. Ada had taken the money from her family's business. He staggered backward, the blood draining from his face. The woman he had trusted, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, had lied to him. She had taken the money, deceived him, and worse, put her family's business at risk without telling him. Ike wanted to storm into the room and confront her, to demand an explanation, but something held him back. His anger was palpable, but it was tangled with a deep sense of betrayal and confusion. If Ada had lied about this, what else had she kept from him? As Ada ended the call with her mother, Ike silently stepped back into the hallway, retreating into the kitchen. His heart was pounding, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He couldn't believe what he had just overheard. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationship was now in shambles, and Ike didn't know how to confront the reality of what had just unfolded. A few minutes later, Ada entered the kitchen, wiping her eyes. She hadn't noticed him earlier, and now she greeted him with a small, forced smile. "You're home early." "Yeah," Ike replied, his voice thick with emotion as he tried to mask the turmoil inside him. He He studied her face, searching for any sign of the deception he had just uncovered, but all he saw was the woman he had loved for years. "Is everything okay?" Ada hesitated, the faintest flicker of fear passing over her face, but she quickly composed herself. "It's just the business, nothing to worry about," she said lightly, though Ike could hear the tension in her voice. The small lie stung him deeply. He nodded, pretending to accept her answer, though the storm of betrayal raged inside him. The woman standing before him suddenly seemed like a stranger, and Ike couldn't shake the feeling that their marriage, everything they had built together, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. After that night, the atmosphere in their apartment shifted dramatically. The warmth that once defined their relationship had vanished, replaced by a cold, unspoken tension. Ike, who had always been open and communicative with Ada, now pulled away from her, struggling to reconcile his feelings of betrayal. He couldn't bring himself to confront her about what he had overheard, but the knowledge of her deceit weighed heavily on his heart. At first, the distance was subtle. Ike started coming home later than usual, using his growing business as an excuse to stay away from the apartment. When he was home, he became more withdrawn, his mind often elsewhere. Ada noticed the change almost immediately, but she didn't know how to approach it. She told herself that Ike was just busy, that the demands of his business were pulling him in different directions, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. One evening, as they sat down to a quiet dinner, Ada finally voiced her concern. "Ike, you've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" Ike barely looked up from his plate, his voice flat and emotionless as he replied, "I'm just tired, Ada. Work's been demanding." Ada reached across the table to take his hand, but Ike subtly pulled away, pretending to adjust his chair. The gesture, though small, stung deeply. "Ike," she said softly, her voice trembling, "if something's bothering you, you can talk to me. We've always faced things together, haven't we?" For a brief moment, Ike considered telling her everything, about what he had overheard, about the doubts and suspicions gnawing at him every time he looked at her. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just need some space," he said, his voice distant. Ada nodded slowly, her heart sinking as she watched the man she loved drift further away from her. She wanted to press him, to ask more, but she was afraid of what she might hear. So she kept her worries to herself, hoping that somehow things would go back to the way they were, but they didn't. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between them only grew. Ike spent more and more time at work or with his business partners, using the demands of his new company as a shield to avoid confronting the emotional turmoil within him. When Ada tried to talk to him, his responses became more clipped, more non-committal. "Everything's fine, Ada," Ike would say whenever she asked how work was going. "Just the usual business stuff." But Ada could hear the emptiness in his words. They weren't partners anymore. He was shutting her out, brick by brick, building a wall between them that seemed impossible to tear down. As Ike spent more time away from home, he grew closer to Stella. She had become someone he could confide in, someone who seemed to understand him in a way that Ada no longer could. At first, their conversations were purely professional, focused on business deals and networking. But over time, the lines between business and personal began to blur. One evening, after an upscale charity gala, Ike found himself sitting across from Stella in a quiet bar. The air was warm, the lights dim, and the soft murmur of conversation filled the space around them. As they talked, Ike opened up about the pressure he was under, about the weight of his growing business, and the strain it had put on his marriage. Stella listened intently, her eyes filled with sympathy and understanding. "You've worked so hard to get where you are," Stella said softly, leaning forward slightly. "It must be exhausting carrying all that weight on your shoulders." Ike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It is. I don't know if I can keep going like this. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing everything. My business, my marriage, everything. Stella's gaze softened as she reached across the table and gently placed her hand on Ike's. The gesture sent a shockwave through him, though he didn't pull away. "You deserve to be happy, Ike," she said quietly, her voice full of quiet assurance. "And you deserve to have a family." Ike blinked, caught off guard by her words. A family. Stella's expression shifted, a flicker of something deeper crossing her face. "I've been meaning to tell you," she began, her voice low and hesitant. "I'm pregnant, Ike. It's yours." Ike felt the ground shift beneath him. Pregnant. His mind raced as he tried to process what Stella had just told him. He had always wanted children, had always dreamed of being a father, but not like this. Not outside of his marriage, not with someone other than Ada. "Are you sure?" Ike asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying the words louder would make them more real. Stella nodded, her expression serious but unwavering. "I'm sure. I found out a few days ago. I didn't know how to tell you, but it's the truth." Ike sat back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared at Stella, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. This wasn't what he had planned, wasn't what he had imagined for his life. But now, the future he had always dreamed of, a family, a child, was being offered to him, albeit in the most complicated way possible. "Ike," Stella said softly, her hand still resting on his, "I know this is a lot to take in, but you need to think about your future. You deserve to be with someone who can give you everything you've ever wanted." Ike swallowed hard, torn between loyalty to Ada and the new possibilities Stella represented. A child, a chance at fatherhood, a fresh start. But could he really leave Ada? Could he walk away from everything they had built together, despite the lies and the cracks in their marriage? "I don't know, Stella," Ike said, his voice strained. It's too much." Stella's hand tightened around his, her voice gentle but insistent. "Just think about it. You don't have to make a decision right now, but I'm here for you, Ike. And I'm ready to build a life with you." Ike nodded, though his mind was far from settled. As he drove home that night, his thoughts were a chaotic mess. Could he really leave Ada for Stella? Could he start over with this new life, knowing that it would mean tearing apart the one he had built with his wife? In the days following Stella's revelation, Ike felt as though his life had split into two. One half of him was still tied to Ada, the woman who had been by his side through the hardest moments, the woman he had once thought he would spend his life with. The other half was being pulled towards Stella, who now carried his child, offering him the chance at fatherhood that he had longed for but never thought possible. Late at night, Ike would find himself driving aimlessly through the city, the streets dark and empty, his thoughts whirling like a storm. He would park in quiet corners, the glow of the streetlights reflecting off his windshield as he replayed the past few months in his head. Every decision, every conversation with Stella, every lie Ada had told, they all circled around him, suffocating him. One night, he parked his car in a secluded area near the water, the cool breeze from the bay drifting through the open window. He stared out at the rippling water, his mind heavy with the impossible choice he faced. Could he leave Ada? He thought about the life they had built together, their tiny apartment, their shared struggles, the late-night conversations, when they held onto each other for comfort in the face of overwhelming adversity. Ada had been his rock, his partner in a world that often seemed too harsh to navigate alone. She had stood by him through financial hardships, through failures and disappointments. But now, the trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship felt irreparably broken. Her lies about the money, the deceit, it gnawed at him, eroding the love and loyalty he still felt for her. But then there was Stella. Stella, with her easy smile, her understanding nature, and now the promise of a child, the one thing Ada could never give him. Ike had always wanted to be a father, had dreamed of the day when he would hold his child in his arms. And now that dream was within reach, but at a cost. Could he really walk away from his marriage for a fresh start? Could he leave Ada behind knowing that it would break her? The guilt was overwhelming. Every time he thought about Ada, a deep sense of betrayal washed over him. She didn't know about Stella, about the baby, about the thoughts that had been consuming him. And yet, he felt betrayed by her too, by the lies she had told, by the secrets she had kept. How could he confront her about what he knew? How could he tell her that he had found out about the money? As Ike sat in his car, the minutes ticking by, he felt paralyzed. He knew he had to make a decision, but the weight of it was too much to bear. No matter what he chose, someone would be hurt, and his life would never be the same again. After weeks of turmoil, sleepless nights, and silent drives around the city, Ike made his decision. The pull towards Stella, the prospect of fatherhood, and the idea of a fresh start proved too strong to resist. One evening, as he sat across from Ada at the dinner table, he finally broke the silence that had been building between them for weeks. "Ada," Ike began, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "I don't think we can continue like this." Ada looked up, her eyes widening in shock. She had feared this moment was coming, but had desperately clung to the hope that they could salvage their marriage. "What do you mean, Ike?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I've met someone," he admitted, each word feeling like a dagger. "Her name is Stella. She's pregnant with my child." The colour drained from Ada's face, her breath catching in her throat. The room seemed to spin around her as the weight of Ike's confession settled in. She had known things were bad, but this was a betrayal she hadn't expected. "Ike, how could you?" Ada whispered, her voice breaking. "After everything we've been through, how could you do this to me?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," Ike said, his voice soft but resolute. "But it did, and I need to be there for my child. I need to start a new life." Ada's heart shattered. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to grasp the reality of what Ike was telling her. The man she had loved, the man she had sacrificed so much for, was walking away from her to be with another woman. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Within months, Ike and Stella officially began their new life together. The months leading up to the birth of their daughter were a blur of preparations, excitement, and the promise of a fresh start. When their baby girl, named Maya, was born, Ike held her in his arms, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions he had never felt before. Fatherhood was everything he had dreamed of, and for a brief moment, Ike thought he had made the right choice. While Ike's life seemed to be moving forward, Ada's world was crumbling. After the devastating revelation of Ike's affair and his decision to be with Stella, Ada was left broken and lost. But it wasn't just the emotional betrayal that shattered her. It was how Ike treated her afterward. The man who had once been her partner, her rock, had now turned cold and distant. One day, after months of living in limbo, Ike asked Ada to leave the apartment they had shared for years. "It's not fair to either of us to keep living like this," he said, his tone firm. "I'm with Stella now. You need to move on." Ada was devastated, standing in the doorway of the home she had built with Ike. "This was our home, Ike," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How can you just throw me out like this?" "I'm sorry, Ada," Ike replied, his voice emotionless. "It's better this way." With nowhere else to go, Ada packed her things and left the apartment. The place that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a prison of memories. As she walked away, carrying the remnants of her old life in a suitcase, she felt as though the world had collapsed around her. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger. The weeks following her departure were the darkest of Ada's life. She moved into a small, cheap apartment on the other side of town, the silence of her new surroundings mirroring the emptiness she felt inside. Every corner of her old life with Ike haunted her, every memory of their time together now tainted by betrayal. Ada couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. She spent her days in a daze, her heart heavy with the weight of all she had lost. The man she had once trusted with her whole heart had not only left her for another woman, but he had also cast her aside, forcing her to start over completely alone. The loneliness was unbearable. But as time passed, something inside Ada began to shift. Slowly, with the help of friends and family, she began to rebuild her life. The pieces didn't fall back into place overnight, but she found strength in the brokenness. Little by little, Ada started to heal. Meanwhile, on the surface, Ike's life seemed to be thriving. He had a beautiful baby girl, a new partner in Stella, and a growing business. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The business that had once brought him so much success started to falter. Clients began pulling away. Deals that had seemed promising fell through, and the pressure of balancing work with a newborn began to take its toll on Ike. At first, Ike dismissed the issues as temporary setbacks. He believed he could fix things, that his business would recover just as it had in the past. But as the months went on, the problems only grew worse. Long-time clients, frustrated by delays and unmet promises, started pulling their accounts. New deals fell through, leaving Ike scrambling to make ends meet. The stress was overwhelming. Ike found himself working late into the night, trying to salvage his once thriving business. But no matter how hard he tried, things kept slipping through his fingers. The once bright future he had envisioned with Stella and their daughter now seemed uncertain, and the weight of his choices began to catch up with him. As the years passed, Ike's business continued to spiral downward. What had once been a success story had now turned into a cautionary tale. Financial troubles mounted, and the stress of trying to keep the company afloat began to strain his relationship with Stella. The once easy, carefree dynamic between them had been replaced by arguments and resentment. "I can't keep doing this, Ike," Stella said one evening, her voice filled with frustration. "You're never around, and when you are, you're stressed and distant. This isn't the life I signed up for." "I'm doing the best I can," Ike snapped, his own frustration boiling over. "I'm trying to save the business. For us. For Maya." But it was no use. The love that had once drawn them together was now overshadowed by the weight of their problems. As Ike's business crumbled, so did his relationship with Stella. The financial struggles, the long hours, and the constant tension had driven a wedge between them that neither could ignore. Stella packed her bags with Maya and left. While Ike's life was falling apart, Ada's life was slowly coming back together. After months of healing, she had met someone new, a kind, patient man named David. David was everything Ike hadn't been: supportive, loving, and gentle. He didn't rush Ada to move on from her past, but instead, he helped her rebuild her future. Their relationship blossomed, and before long, Ada found herself in love again. It was a love that was quieter, more stable than what she had experienced with Ike, but it was exactly what she needed. A year after they met, Ada and David got married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by friends and family. Soon after, Ada discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a joy she hadn't felt in years. She was starting a new chapter in her life, one that was free from the pain of the past. As she looked forward to becoming a mother, she realized just how far she had come since the day Ike had left her. As things continued to worsen for Ike, both professionally and personally, he found himself thinking more and more about Ada. He couldn't deny that his life had taken a turn for the worse since he had left her. The business he had built with the money Ada had risked everything for was crumbling, and his relationship with Stella was on the brink of collapse. His thoughts often drifted to Ada, wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. One day, consumed by guilt and regret, Ike decided to reach out to Ada. He knew it had been years, but he felt compelled to apologize for the way he had treated her, for leaving her, for everything. He drove to Ada's new home, his heart pounding as he stood at the door, rehearsing what he would say. When Ada opened the door, she looked different, more radiant, more at peace than he had ever seen her. "Ada, I need to talk to you," Ike stammered, his voice shaking. "I made a mistake. I'm so sorry for everything, for leaving you, for hurting you. I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." Ada stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then quietly she said, "Ike, it's too late." Ada continued to explain to Ike that she had been working behind the scenes to ensure Ike's business gained momentum. Unknowingly to Ike, it was Ada who secured him key contracts from her father's company, pivotal to the early success of his business. Despite their strained financial situation, Ada's influence within her family's business allowed her to steer opportunities Ike's way, helping him flourish. However, when Ike began to distance himself from Ada, eventually pushing her away completely, something in Ada shifted. The pain of his rejection, coupled with his growing detachment, prompted Ada to make a difficult decision. No longer willing to watch Ike thrive while their relationship crumbled, Ada quietly ceased her efforts. Ike's heart sank as he heard what Ike said. He also noticed the small bump under Ada's dress. She was pregnant. His mind raced, realizing that she had moved on, had found happiness without him. "I've moved on, Ike," Ada continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm happy now. I'm married and I'm expecting a child. What we had is over." The words hit Ike like a sledgehammer. He had come hoping for redemption, for a chance to make things right. But now he realized that he was too late. Ada had rebuilt her life without him. As Ike's business continued to fall apart, he finally understood the true cost of his actions. He had lost not only the support Ada had quietly given him, but also the love and trust that once held them together. By the time Ike realized his mistakes, Ada had already moved forward with her life, finding strength and joy in a new beginning without him. Left alone with his regrets, Ike learned a painful lesson. Success built on selfishness and neglect cannot last, and sometimes the people we hurt the most are the ones we need the most. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this. Thank you for watching and see you next time.